I'd like to open this event, of course, with a welcome to country. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal and Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as to emerging leaders and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. Thank you. We thought to set the tone, it would be wonderful to have a little bit of music. And we're really lucky to have Ben Adler. He's a violinist and actually a leader of a klezmer fusion band called Chutney, and also director of the renamed and now Sheer Festival. So Ben's going to play us and tell us about two songs that he chose predominantly and that set the tone. Thanks, Ben.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Miriam, for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here and to contribute in a small way to what I'm sure will be a very moving, powerful, and resonant afternoon. The two songs I've chosen to play to start off with are both either Polish or Polish adjacent in honor of Henry, Yiddish Polish specifically. The first is Wohin soll ich gehen, which is Where Shall I Go? It's a very poignant and powerful song describing the wandering Jew, composed by a fellow called Oskar Strock, who was Latvian, lyrics by a gentleman called Igor Korntaja, who was born in Poland in the 1890s and who was murdered in Auschwitz in 1942. According to some of my research, the tune may have been based on a Russian tango called Blue Eyes, so I've included some tango moments in my rendition. It was written before World War II, but it became very popular in the ghettos and in the DP camps. And the second piece, which I'll sort of medley my way into, is Papierosen, which is Yiddish for cigarettes, composed by Herman Yablokov, who was a Belarusian or then Russian composer, but born in a town of Polish majority. And he actually wrote this song in 1922. This is seeing the heartbreaking sights of children peddling cigarettes in Grodno in Belarus after the pogroms that followed World War I.
Next, a person I'd like to ask up to the stage is someone that many of you know very well, Eva Fischl. She is OAM and President of the Joint in Australia. Eva got off the plane this morning from a trip to Romania and Israel, examining and receiving awards on behalf of Joint for the contributions that Australia has made in those places. The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee funded the transportation of Henry, my grandfather, and his family to Australia after the war, and assisted more than 75,000 Jewish survivors in displaced person camps after the war. So we're incredibly grateful to Eva, despite her journey, to actually introduce the event. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
There's not a script there. Thank you. Thank you. So welcome all the Reiss family, the Levy family, distinguished guests and everyone, the whole Jewish community. It's a wonderful amount of people, and it's a tribute to you and the book. Well, I think I have to say that since 2023, when Miriam asked me to introduce the launch of her grandfather's amazing book, The Engineers, the world really does seem a very different place. Abba even said as far back as 1963, oh, thank you. Tragedy is the difference between what is and what might have been. I do not for 1 minute diminish the uniqueness of the Holocaust, or I also am a child of the Holocaust, and I think my life has been defined by it. However, I do find parallels between the settings of Henry Reiss's book, The Engineers, and the world after the 7th of October. As Jews, we have often tended to define our history as before the Holocaust and after the Holocaust. Since the 7th of October 2023, it is now before the events of the 7th of October and after the 7th of October. The dark shadows of anti-Semitism at the time hit Europe and culminated in the Holocaust. However, on a bright side, in contrast, now that we have Israel, we do have the emotions of optimism that we must, we can, and we will prevail. All these emotions are very intertwined and it's very complex. So we do form a life from a different perspective. Israel, after all, for all of us, doesn't just mean a government at any given point, which you may or may not agree with. It is a nation that has developed habits of mind and action over 75 years of sovereign life and thousands of years before that. One could well ask, what is it that makes certain nations resilient and resourceful in the face of adversity? One could equally ask, what is it that makes certain individuals so strong and innovative in the face of adversity? Nowhere does one see these characteristics of resilience more on display than in the brilliant work of Henry Reiss's Engineers. Historians and political scientists have studied this sort of resilience for decades and the reasons behind it. They have found two unique and related characteristics, namely human and social capital. The human capital displayed by talent, skills and knowledge of a population help produce solutions to problems that can defeat others. Social capital is the form that openness, patriotism, personal and public responsibilities enable man and societies to make the most of this human capital. In The Engineers, as we follow Henry Reiss's brilliant, really brilliant, hour-by-hour journey of suspense, while he fights for his and his family's survival, he does portray the penultimate combination of man's will to survive and the ingenuity of finding ways to do so. We see through his eyes the very worst of humanity, with occasional glimpses of the very best in humanity, and the immeasurable consequences of these two extremities. For example, witnessing through his eyes the juxtaposition of Vienna of 1988 with restaurants full of people eating, drinking, singing, and the Vienna of 1938 when Hitler had annexed Austria and the Viennese were celebrating the Nazis' rise to power and the spilling of Jewish blood. As we fast forward to this year, I could not help reflect how the whole world may have been bringing in the new year of 2024, and at midnight people were counting down with music and fireworks and hoping for a brighter year. Our brethren in Israel, instead of fireworks, were listening to the Iron Dome battery intercepting 27 missiles just on that one night into central Israel by courtesy of Hamas at midnight. Again, we see the juxtaposition of life if you are a Jew living in Israel or a Jew living in the diaspora. The indomitable spirit of Henry Reiss during the roller coaster of emotions depicted in his book is even more relevant today than it was when he wrote it. Apart from the actual interest of the specific storyline, it is an in-depth learning curve of the characteristics of a unique man. I learned much from reading this enthralling book, much about history, people, the determination to survive against all odds, and the very attributes that Henry Reiss had are the ones that I saw in display amongst our people in Israel today. Theodor Herzl said, "Whole branches of Judaism may wither and fall, but the trunk of Judaism always remains. Of course, Israel is our trunk. Thus, on the 7th of October, some of our branches were torn from us, but the trunk remains strong and firm." I'm sure Henry Reiss, with his fortitude, has passed on to his daughters Elizabeth and Christine, and granddaughters Miriam, Lucy, and grandson Michael, and also to the next generation, this strength to fight. Henry Reiss's book displays the brushstroke of a potentially literary giant if he would have chosen to be an author instead of an engineer. It is certainly a book I shall treasure and never forget, and I urge you all to buy it. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much. So Henry Reiss is my grandfather, and I'm sorry, I also acknowledge Debbie and Naomi, who are here today, as the other grandchildren, which I must have forgotten to mention to Eva, so that's okay. It's not Eva's fault. So the next person I'd like to welcome is Christine Hill onto the stage. So my aunt Christine, she was born in Hungary at the end of the war, and they were still uncertain whether to remain as Christians or reclaim their identity as Jews, and undoubtedly that influenced her naming. She prefers Krisha. Chris helped with the editing and production of Henry's original memoir. And his voice is wonderful, and it's evident even in the introduction that he wrote in the book. And so it gives me great pleasure to ask Krisha, on behalf of Henry, to read his introduction to you.
Thank you, Miri, for that beautiful introduction. I'm going to have trouble reading at the moment, I think. So these were my dad's words that he put in the first edition of the book, which, as you may know, was called January 1944, which, by the way, was personally, privately published literally on his deathbed as he was in hospital saying goodbye. We were collecting the printed copies of that book. And thanks to Miri and lots of hard work and effort on her and a few others, we've now been able to bring it to this point. And this is the original introduction which remains in the book today. I began writing this memoir a few days after leaving Soviet-occupied Budapest and arriving in the American zone of Germany in July 1946. We were staying in a camp for displaced persons in the small German town of Ulm on the Danube. Since then, whenever I've had a peaceful moment in a quiet corner, I tried to put on paper some of those nightmarish years still so vivid in my mind. With this story, I also wanted to answer the questions asked so often. How did it happen that we were among the few survivors of the 6 million European Jews who perished in the Holocaust? Our surviving family unit consisted of me, my wife Lucia, both of us 39 years old, and 2 children, El Junior, aged 8 years, and a baby girl, Krisha. Like many other displaced people, we had neither documents nor money and possessed no visa to another country, no knowledge of any overseas language. Even the name we were still using was false, for we felt it was too early to revert to our real name. If the reader wonders why, with so many disadvantages, we chose to become immigrants instead of returning to our country, Poland, particularly when the Polish government had offered us attractive positions within our profession as qualified engineers in the reconstruction of the war-torn country, the answer can best be understood by the story related in this book. The reasons go back to my childhood. I was born in Krakow in 1907, when this beautiful town was still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The first words I would listen to and the first words I uttered were Polish. I attended Polish schools, learned and loved Polish romantic literature, admired the country's great history, and became deeply attached to the Polish landscape, the soil of my fatherland. I considered myself Polish and was proud to belong to this great and once powerful nation. Proudly, I joined in the singing of Poland's national anthem, Nie damy ziemi skąd nasz ród. We shall not surrender the land of our ancestors. Apologies for my dreadful Polish. But there was another side to my life. My Polish home was also a Jewish home. My parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents were Jewish. That factor was to weigh heavily over my existence. In pre-war Poland, I was confronted with a Polish-Jewish conflict that intensified through World War II. I survived only because I changed my identity to Piotr Darasz, a Roman Catholic Pole. As Henry Reiss, I would have perished together with my wife and child. When the war ended, we were in Hungary. Poles, including a few Jewish survivors, were returning home to Poland. But where was our home? It was an existential dilemma. To return to our true identity with the name of Reiss and potentially be exposed to the Polish-Jewish conflict, or to continue as Christian, Darasz, detaching ourselves and our children from the Jewish nation. The heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto had fought against impossible odds not even for survival, but for an honourable death. Young Jewish boys and girls gave their lives so that we, the survivors, could be proud of our heritage and tell future generations of the horrible suffering of their people. How could I fulfil my part in telling that story without renouncing my false identity, Piotr Darash? We made up our minds. We would venture as the Reiss family into an unknown world, hoping to find a place under the sun, but far from the scenes of our people's martyrdom, a place where we would not be hated by our neighbours, where our children would not be held responsible for the crucifixion of Christ. The writing of this story has had many interruptions since we made that momentous decision. The inevitable problems confronting newly arrived immigrants consumed much of my time and energy, dissipating the concentration needed to recall those turbulent years. After the death of Lusha, my unforgettable companion in our struggle, I again took up this story. Once again, I relived those years of war by recalling our unbelievable experiences. I have tried to reflect on those whose lives intertwined with ours, those whose bravery and nobility led them to give us a helping hand, often at the risk of their own security, as well as those whose prejudice and hatred could have destroyed us. With eternal gratitude, I shall cherish and respect the memory of the former. The latter are left to God's judgment. Australia, 1991. Thank you for letting me share. I'll give you a little
Mum, I wonder if you feel like you might just say hello to everyone and see if you'd like to just say a few words. This is my mum, the El Junia, you heard mentioned here, Mum.
Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for coming. My father and mother, they would be extremely proud that you have all come to hear their story. I took them for granted, of course, as all children do. But I now realize, and every morning when I wake up, I thank my father particularly, my mother too, for all that they did to survive the war with me. They had alternatives. They could have just given up. They could have left me. I remember one time overhearing a discussion about, should they actually take me? I would be a burden, a young child of 5. And without saying who said what, they did decide to bring me along. And every morning I wake up and I say thank you for all that you did to survive the war, all the thinking, all the planning, all the guidance, and it wasn't easy. Coming to Australia was wonderful. This was a country, and I remember my parents saying, there's no anti-Semitism. There's a country without anti-Semitism. They couldn't believe it. And, well, there may be some anti-Semitism. But when we came to Australia, we didn't encounter, in all the years that we've lived here, we didn't actually personally encounter any anti-Semitism. Our neighbours were surprised at the foreigners. My father, when we came to Australia, the first thing he did was set up the garden outside. He set up floodlights, and then he planted vegetables. And in Chatswood, the neighbours who were working were surprised at night. He was gardening. Well, what shall I say now? No, I'm so grateful to them, but I'm grateful to all of you for coming today. And thank you.
So Mum was born in 1938 in Krakow, and she was actually 6 years old, tied with kind of tea towels or something on the back of a guide across the Carpathian Mountains to escape Poland and cross Slovakia into Hungary at midnight in winter, dressed in day clothes, every one of them, because otherwise they would look suspicious, and hiding in deep snow when border guards were nearby. And I suppose it's important to say that we don't know, it's hard to know the impact on children of these experiences. There's a lot written on that topic, and no one knows any different because it's their childhood, so how could they know what life would have been like? But thank you, Mum, for saying a few words. Thank you. You can go and sit down. There'll be questions later. Go that way, there's a stair. So, some of you may not realise, I don't think I really did, there is a deep body of academic work actually trying to understand what happened, trying to understand people's responses. It's a complex topic, and obviously everybody is trying to learn from the past to improve our chances in the future, or for other reasons too. But I'm really grateful as well to have Avril Alba. Avril is an associate professor, tenured position, and a chair of Hebrew, Biblical and Jewish Studies at the University of Sydney, and I think we're all collectively fortunate, and it hasn't been an easy role since October 7, as you would all know, the way universities and the general public's responses are not always as complex as the issues deserve. Avril's contributed to the thinking around the role of a Holocaust museum, and was kind enough to share some thoughts for today. So I'm really grateful, Avril Alba, and come to the stage.
Thank you, Miriam, and thank you to the Reiss family, and it's a real privilege to be here today. So, Henry Reiss's remarkable memoir started in the immediate aftermath of the war, but refined over many years, is a testimony to his desire to chronicle the hundreds of incidents that together comprised his survival and that of his wife Lucia and daughter Eljunia. Their epic journey encompasses the outbreak of the Second World War, life under the Soviet and then the German occupation, a risky escape to Hungary, where they again experienced the terror of the Nazis, and finally, after surviving the war, the ordeal of yet again negotiating the Soviet system. The intricacy of the storytelling is in and of itself an accomplishment. In Henry's vivid prose, the multitude of characters and the challenges that they faced come alive. The daily indignities, the struggle, and the anxiety to stay one step ahead of ever-encroaching foes, and the appalling living conditions are finely portrayed. While the intricacy of the account is thus both enlightening and riveting, it is the last two chapters, simply entitled My Thoughts on Anti-Semitism and Kindness, that to my mind give the greatest insight into Henry's character and to the meaning and understanding that he made of his wartime experiences. Having had to live for years under either false papers, on the run, or in hiding to avoid being persecuted by two totalitarian regimes, It makes perfect sense that Henry would try to understand the nature and effects of anti-Semitism. He provides an overview of anti-Semitism's historical contours and seeks in particular to try and understand its religious roots and how these historic prejudices were reformulated and inflamed over centuries. The portrayal of Jews as Christ killers, exploitative capitalists, vengeful communists are all outlined and explored, including how these enduring stereotypes are manifested in everyday life. In his detailed retellings of the many and varied interactions between Jewish and broader communities, Henry lays bare the daily indignities of living as an often reviled minority. For example, Henry and Lucia experience anti-Semitism as university students, beginning with the threat that they might be excluded due to the quotas on Jews, despite their outstanding grades. This discrimination is further exacerbated by fears for their physical safety due to the antagonism of both teachers and fellow students. Their experiences of anti-Semitism then only escalate as they face the possibility of deportation and almost certain death under both Soviet and Nazi systems. As is well known, this sad litany culminates in the near total erasure of the Jews of Poland. Returning to his country twice after the war, it is the absence of the Jewish community that affects Henry most deeply, as a murderous anti-Semitism leaves the Polish landscape judenfrei, free of Jews. One would not blame Henry if he were to end his book despairing of human nature and the possibility for change. Yet the last chapter of his book, Kindness, begins thus, and I quote, "We survived only with the help of these kind men and women." Henry then goes on to list over 3 pages the individuals who helped to save him, Lucia, and Elzunia over the course of the war. I will only read out a selection to give you a sense of the multitude of individuals and the roles they all played in saving these lives. Mr. Josef Elsner, my pre-war employer in Krakow, who by issuing me false employment certificates enabled me to start a new life as Piotr Daraj. Irina Bartolowicz, our landlady in Warsaw, who undoubtedly knew our true identity, but nevertheless allowed us to live in her flat and did not take financial advantage of us. Mrs. Biljowska, the shop owner, who, although aware of my real identity, was selling me black market food at moderate prices, even sometimes adding sweets for my child. Johann Rudisch, a German from Sudetenland and building inspector of the Deutsche Ostbahn, for helping me obtain a railway pass to the Slovakian border. Jurek Nowkowski, who risked his life by guiding us in the bright daylight from the railway station to the smuggler's chief, the forest ranger. Pavel Lieber, the forest ranger, who risked his life by organising the escape into Slovakia for many desperate people like us and coordinating the Polish gorals, trusted mountaineers and reliable guides. And those courageous unknown mountaineers, one Pole, one Slovak, one Hungarian, who during the freezing nights of January 1944 guided us across the Polish, Slovakian, Hungarian borders. The unknown villagers, both Slovak and Hungarian, who exposed themselves to arrest and persecution by giving us shelter, food, and transport during our escape to Hungary. Then, even more poignantly, Henry continues, "I also feel thankful for the following: the Polish policemen who, satisfied with the ransom of 1,000 zlotys extorted from Lucia, never harassed her again. The SS Obsturmführer of the Gestapo headquarters, who, although undoubtedly aware of Lucia's racial identity, let her go free. The blackmailer in Warsaw, who exerted from me half my money and my gold watch, but unwittingly taught me how to avoid similar criminal encounters on the streets of Warsaw." Now, why do I find these last 3 examples so extraordinary? To my mind, they reveal the intricacies and tensions that make up true histories. In remembering these flawed individuals, Henry reminds us that most human beings are not saints, but neither are they outright sinners. Rather, most are ordinary people caught up in systems and conflicts over which they have little control and yet must somehow negotiate. In thanking the less salubrious characters whose actions, while self-serving, ultimately contributed to his and his family's survival, Henry exposes the complexity of human nature and the reality of human frailty in the face of adversity. What then is the significance of Henry's labours and those of his granddaughter Miriam to chronicle this remarkable story? Such detailed work of reconstruction no doubt fills the gaps of the historical record, allowing us to understand the personal impact of overarching and oppressive regimes. One could also, and perhaps should, extrapolate lessons about the dangers and persistence of anti-Semitism, one of the most compelling and perhaps perplexing aspects of the work. But to my mind, the overriding contribution of the book is that it provides a window into a single experience within which we can perceive the full complexity of the human condition, both historically and in the present. As I note this remarkable propensity of the work, I'm also deeply aware as a historian that one should not read history with an eye to the present, as it is only through honouring the specificity of each human experience that we uncover the sort of strangeness of the past. To truly understand the motivations and the actions of those who came before us, we cannot assume that they are the same as us, nor that we would respond as they did if faced with similar challenges. If we don't bring this perspective to bear on memoirs such as Henry's, then all history would only be an account of the present, and our understanding of the past would be both compromised and poorer as a result. Yet, as I close the book, reflecting on both its content and its protagonist, I could not help but conclude that despite this historical distance, in Henry's and in his family's struggle, there are universal elements that speak to us across generations. The desire to uphold human dignity, the belief in human equality, and the bonds of friendship and love that span lifetimes and continents, they fill the pages of this memoir. In these elements, we find our common bonds, which extend and endure beyond temporal and geographical distance. Through documenting the details of their survival, Henry reveals his and his family's vulnerability alongside their remarkable and unshakable resilience and resolve. In this troubled world that we currently inhabit, there is comfort in knowing that these ultimately human and humane values will prevail. Thank you.
Boy, oh boy, you're getting your money's worth. Look, we actually do have time, luckily, and I think it is very worthwhile to try and have a little bit of discussion. I don't know how it will go, and if there aren't any thoughts or questions, that's actually fine as well, and then I'll have an opportunity to thank everyone and invite you for coffee and cake. But I'd really like to welcome, for discussion, Eva Fischl, Avril, and my mum, Eljunia, as a survivor, onto the stage. And Joshua's going to mic up, and while he's doing that, Ben has kindly offered to play us one more piece, and then we'll open up for questions. My uncle James will carry a travelling mic, so put your hands up. But at the moment, we'll just have the opportunity for one more amazing piece, Ben. Thank you.
This piece is a special request from Miriam. Requires little introduction. It's the theme from Schindler's List.
Gosh, wow. It's hard to think of a question just when we've listened to that beautiful piece. Thank you so much. So I don't know if anyone wants to start. It's always hard to start thinking about, especially with Henry not here. But I suppose, I think while people are thinking about questions, and obviously many people have not read the book, but I think we don't have to stick to the topic of the book, but it's opportunity to just discuss why it's important. Dasha is a very close friend of Mum and has her own survival story. You might have noticed her photo is up in the museum just as you came in the reverberations. So Dasha Black.
I'm very moved by this occasion today because Henry Reiss and your mother, Lucia, were close friends of mine. And Elizabeth is probably, if not the first, certainly one of the first girls I met in Australia and friends. There are strange, interesting parallels. We are 2 months apart in age. I'm 2 months older. That my parents were also professionals living in the part of Poland that was occupied in September 39. We also moved east. And I must say, I'm reading the book and I can't put it down. It's a real page turner. And
keep talking.
All right. And I appreciate, the difference between us is that my Elizabeth and her parents survived the war due to planning, due to providence, due to kindness of all those people on the 3 pages, and my parents did not. They were murdered in 1943 when I was 5 years old. And I often think that one of the other factors is something called lady luck. With all this, and I appreciate, because you're a wise woman, that you wake up in the morning and say, thank goodness, not only for those very, very carefully planned, probably engineering minds that your parents had, but also for something called luck, and how wonderful it is. And I think to see you and your children and grandchildren here, the grandchildren of the great-grandchildren of Henry Reiss and his parents, is just to me very powerful.
Can I just follow on that, the kind of the luck and the survivors, but my memory, and I'm interested if there's any truth in this, but my memory, my grandfather, Henry, we called him Granddaddy, he didn't talk of it. We knew he was working on the book, but we didn't know any stories. It was not dinner table conversation. And obviously there's lots of reasons why half of the kids in my year at school were children of Holocaust survivors. So, but one of the elements of their survival story was being on false papers. And I'm curious, Mum, if you have any thoughts about whether there was any different experience being a survivor of, or if anyone has any comment of a camp. Many people who are not Jewish say to me, oh, your family survived. What camp were they in? And this is a complex. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Avril, or yeah.
Okay. This is actually, you bring up an issue that's been a complex one over years, which is that the first stories really that we heard in many ways were the survivors from the camps, because it's the most visible, if you like, representation of what happened to Jews under Nazism. But over the years, the stories have become more and more complex, and because of that, I think even amongst survivors, I know my own father also survived in the Soviet Union, and he always used to talk about surviving in the war, and he wouldn't call himself a Holocaust survivor, because he said even though he was in a Soviet camp. They did this amongst themselves. It wasn't as bad as a Nazi camp. I mean, I'm not quite sure how you weigh how you weigh those things up, but they did. I think the survivors amongst themselves had these conversations. But in terms of the research, what we're finding more and more of is that these survival stories are incredibly diverse, and of course each one unique, and each one, Dasha, as you say, has its own elements and its own bits of luck and planning and all of that. But I think the most recent story, and we've had people in the museum, in fact, who've researched in this area, started research, Rita Nash is one of them, is that the majority of people who are going to survive, Polish Jews, will survive because they go into the Soviet Union, right? Or they somehow survive under the Soviet system. So again, these stories, even now, we're really just beginning to know how important they were and what happened to those people during the war years.
My good friend and old neighbour, Jane Doolan, has a question.
I've had the great joy of getting the book, so do not leave without buying it. It is extraordinary and such a pleasure to read, and so moving, to have known, to be the Goy neighbours of, in fact we shared a nanny, so I really do know those beautiful grandchildren so well, and I'm so grateful to Henry and Louisa to have survived, to have given my children the pleasure of having neighbours who were Jewish. Elizabeth, I loved your parents. It's so extraordinary to get to know them and to see their love and respect for each other. I'm really interested, and Avril, from you as well. Henry was a bit of, we're all looking for champions of change, male champions of change. Henry's respect for his wife's professionalism, her resilience, her extraordinary ability to stare down the Gestapo and answer those questions. I won't ruin the story. Spoiler alert, she survives. But tell me about your parents' respect for each other, Elizabeth, and then maybe Avril, a comment on the feminist nature of the Jewish community to the Goys here.
My parents were totally obsessed with one another. They were so in love. And they knew it too, They used to say, well, none of our friends have a marriage as good as our marriage. We are the best, we have the best marriage. And it was mutual. And my mother was very, very competent. She was competent at her work. She was competent in the kitchen. She was competent with friends. The only thing my father was wonderful. He had a sense of humour. Practical sense of humour. He would even move a chair. If somebody was going to sit down, he'd move the chair a little bit, And he'd hope the person wouldn't totally fall down. He'd put the chair back just in time. And then I remember he'd have somebody on their lap and he would gesticulate while they were talking so that it was explained what the person was saying in a very Jewish way. People used to gesticulate in Europe, and when we came to Australia, nobody gesticulated. Just Anglo-Saxons don't do that. My parents' love was the greatest thing. It helped them to survive too, because they had an aim to survive for one another.
I guess the one thing I would add, is just affirm in answer to your question is, I think anyone who's ever met Jewish women knows that they're pretty strong, right? So even though there may be structural inequalities in traditional Jewish religion and even in Jewish communities, there's extraordinary leadership by Jewish women. I have an example of that right next to me in Eva. And I wondered if perhaps, Eva, it's more appropriate for you to say something about women in Jewish communities.
I'm not sure that I can comment on women in Jewish communities, but I think in reference to what you're saying, what struck me coming from a family that unfortunately was totally fractured, because you referred before to luck, well, I was very lucky because I survived, but I was a hidden child and my father died in the camps and I never knew him. And I've often thought in life that I think that nuclear family of mother, father, child or children, that bond is so strong, and I'm sure that in some ways, you said before, it helped them survive, the love they had for each other. And even though a child might have been a bit difficult to look after, but also the child, I think that's a very, very strong concept in Judaism, and the strong bonds that we have for our family. And I've always been maybe slightly envious of people that have had the brothers and sisters and the extended family, because I did not. And I think, as you said, there are many different ways the Holocaust affected people, and I did hear whether you went to camp or didn't go to camp, and I'm sure you're the expert in studies, but it has been proven that children of the Holocaust who grew up, for instance, the way I did, I wouldn't like to go down there, how many issues they have, but I'm sure they exist, and I'm sure they're very real. So
I'm sure I'm extremely neurotic, and it's not something that I created. It's the childhood that I had. I was a very lonely child. I had no friends, even in Poland. You know, I wanted to play with. I said, why can't I go to kindergarten? My mother always had an answer, just because. You just can't go, don't ask any questions. So I couldn't ask any questions. I was very quiet and very obedient, and just without any initiative, because I couldn't initiate anything. So I survived, but I'm very neurotic even now. And I was determined to not make my children neurotic.
There's a whole literature on children of survivors and the psychological damage that they have endured.
Is that the next book?
Oh, Elizabeth. Liz is an old friend from school, and it's so lovely that some people from Mariah are here, so thank you so much for coming. Oh, sorry, Deb.
I am part of the family. I do apologise. So I was actually just wondering, in the body of evidence that you've got, we talked about neurosis, an impression about cancer. So we lost our grandmother to cancer after her survival, and then later on to cardiovascular disease. The male, Henry, who wrote the book. Is there evidence? Where are things at with the Holocaust survivors, and how many of them have painful cancer, which is our family and sort of thing, or is that just something to pose to the room that might not have an answer?
You know, I don't know. I must admit I'm not aware. You know, that doesn't mean that there aren't such studies. I'd be happy to try and find out for you, but I can't answer that off the cuff. Sorry.
I just want to say, in introducing Liz Hovey, I introduced her as my school friend, but she's an oncologist, so feel free to answer Deb's question.
That's helpful.
An oncologist, but not an epidemiologist. So I'm not quite. I don't think there's any robust evidence that there's a link between the Holocaust and cancer. I mean, there've been so many advances in cardiovascular medicine that people are living longer to get their cancers, because cancer is overall a disease of ageing, although obviously younger people get them too. I've got some colleagues in psychology who've done some extraordinary cohort studies over many decades, following people with stress and different personalities in terms of actually looking to see if people who are more anxious and have more stress in their external stress in their lives actually get more cancer, and all of those studies have been negative so far. So.
Can I say, in our family we have a cancer gene, so it's been identified.
Yes, so of course Ashkenazi Jewish people do have BRCA genes and other genetic propensities for increased cancer adventures. So, but that's different from the stress of the Holocaust. So that I don't think that kind of anguish. I don't think there's any strong evidence that anguish leads to cancer. in fact, the same psychologist did a study of melanoma and reactions to it, and there were people that were optimistic, pessimistic, and in complete denial. And the optimists didn't do better than the pessimists. There was a small group of people in complete denial. They did very well.
Maybe that's the way
Anyhow,
to go.
that's not what I don't.
I think the last question from Liz.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anyhow, my question is, there has been some reference to the fact there's been a memoir before, and I know it's been a labour of love for you in recent years. So I'm just really interested, Miriam, what was the catalyst for repackaging this and republishing it, and what are the main differences between the original memoir and this new outing?
As Chris said, literally just after his funeral was the first time we laid eyes on this printed book. It wasn't published, it was printed for family and friends, and of course read it, and of course it's an amazing book. And there it has sat for quite some time, and we all know it was an amazing book, but I don't know, I have a strong work ethic, and I often have hobbies, and I always felt really sad that, it was pre the age of even floppy disks, so there was no digital copy, and I just felt like, gosh, it really needs to be on Amazon. It needs to be somewhere where when my children are old enough to be bothered reading it, it will exist, not just be these copies on our shelves. But, and I couldn't write a book, but I am a very effective editor and proofreader. And it had many, helps. Chris did a lot of work to refine the language, to make it flow, to reduce, to just improve it. And so it was a bit of a labour of love over a number of years in all my free time, which I just have so much of. And then it was quite hard to get a publisher. And along the way, there were some people in the family who were just slightly concerned about changing his voice, or, it's done, why are you doing this? And I just, as I do, ignored them all. And I felt like the original's still available if anyone wants to read it, but there's only a few copies. But I felt like I was intelligent enough to distinguish refining language for the reader's purpose of it flowing well to changing his voice. And of course the narrative stands exactly as is. So thanks for asking to give me an opportunity to share that with you. But hopefully I was very brave and cold called Philip Sands, and he's an incredible intellect and human rights lawyer and author, because his story also, if you've read East West Street, involves Lvov, where my grandfather was, and so he gave it advanced praise, and that's on the cover of the book. And that turned it from being, his granddaughter thinks it's really good, like you really should read it, into something that is legitimised. And I just cold emailed him and fell over when I got a response. So I just want to say a few thank yous, and then we will break. So firstly, as I said, huge thanks to Philip Sands. Many of the family helped in various ways, and I thank particularly David for his patient support, and Krisha for her support, and Mum, of course, who helped a lot with the blurb. Lisbeth Hink is a Dutch art historian and publisher, and she was profoundly affected in 2014 when she published a Holocaust memoir. She was a publisher, and Manny Steinberg had his launch in Dachau. And at that moment, she's not Jewish and had never had anything to do with the Holocaust, but at that moment she decided to dedicate her publishing efforts entirely to Holocaust memoirs, in her words, before there are no survivors left to tell their story. I want to thank Ilana Bodenstein. Ilana is my niece, Lucy's daughter. Where are you, Ilana? Ilana is an artist, and it is her beautiful cover design that graces the book. And she spent many hours and had many different ideas. This idea is all hers. And the folded paper house on the front cover is actually transformed from a document with Henry Reiss's false papers on the back that you'll recognise his name through it. I want to thank Eva Fischl and Avril Alba. Go ahead, Lucy. This is a generosity that has given gravitas to today, without which it wouldn't be the same event. And I mean, it's a long book, and I think yours and obviously Ben's contributions have made this event, so I'm so grateful. Thank you so much. I want to acknowledge Richard Haber. Where's Richard? Richard Haber is in the book. Richard is older than Mum by about 4 years, and Richard, the Haber family and the Reiss family crossed the Carpathian Mountains together in the story, but also were good friends in Krakow and Poland before the war. So the Haber family and the Reiss family are intertwined, and it's given that both of them survived without any family, and of course Henry's mother had 11 siblings. David's mapped the family tree. His father, you know, these were huge families. So these are two people who survived with not an aunt, not an uncle, and not a cousin. So the families were very close, and it's lovely that you could be here. And Richard has also written his own story.
My father used to say, the Haber family and the Reiss family are one family.
And thank you so much for coming, because obviously without you it doesn't exist.